There exists perhaps no greater triumph of propaganda over historical truth than the enduring myth of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as savior of America during the Great Depression. For decades, we've been told that FDR's bold experimentation and compassionate government intervention rescued the nation from economic catastrophe. This narrative has become so entrenched in our collective consciousness that questioning it seems almost heretical. Yet question it we must. For the evidence reveals a far different story, one of well-intentioned incompetence that actually prolonged American suffering and fundamentally altered the relationship between citizen and state in ways the founders would have found abhorrent. The real Roosevelt story isn't one of heroic rescue but of how personal charm and political theater can mask profound policy failures. It's a tale that reveals the dangerous seduction of charismatic leadership divorced from economic understanding, and how the intellectuals of one generation can lead an entire nation astray through their arrogant certainty in untested theories. Most disturbing of all, it demonstrates how crisis becomes opportunity for ambitious politicians to expand government power far beyond constitutional limits, creating precedents that echo through generations. Today, as we face our own economic challenges, understanding this history isn't merely academic, it's essential for preserving both prosperity and liberty. Chapter 1: The Man Behind the Mask, Roosevelt's Character and Early Failures. To understand how Roosevelt could inflict such damage while maintaining public adoration, we must first examine the man himself. Franklin Roosevelt possessed that most dangerous combination in politics: boundless self-confidence coupled with profound ignorance of economic principles. Born into privilege, educated at elite institutions, he moved through life with the casual arrogance of one who had never truly faced the consequences of his own failures. Roosevelt's character was formed not by struggle against genuine adversity, but by the careful cultivation of image over substance. Even his famous battle with polio, while personally heroic, became a masterclass in political theater. He learned early that perception mattered more than reality, that confidence could substitute for competence, and that the American people could be led to believe almost anything if presented with sufficient charm and conviction. His early political career revealed troubling patterns that would later plague his presidency. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, Roosevelt showed a reckless enthusiasm for expanding federal power and an alarming indifference to constitutional constraints. His disastrous venture into business with the Fidelity and Deposit Company of Maryland demonstrated his complete lack of understanding of basic economic principles, a preview of what was to come on a national scale. What made Roosevelt particularly dangerous was his intellectual insecurity masked by supreme self-assurance. Surrounded by academic theorists and progressive intellectuals, he absorbed their fashionable disdain for traditional American values of limited government, individual responsibility, and free enterprise. He became convinced that he could remake American society through the sheer force of government intervention, never doubting his own wisdom or questioning the premises of his advisors. This character assessment isn't mere personal attack. It's essential for understanding how policy disasters occur. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't born from careful analysis of what had worked in the past, but from his desperate need to appear decisive and his faith in the intellectual fads of his time. He experimented with the American economy like a child playing with dynamite, never considering that his failures would mean genuine suffering for millions of ordinary Americans who trusted his promises of recovery. Chapter 2: The Real Causes of the Great Depression, Government Failure, Not Market Failure. Before examining Roosevelt's disastrous response, we must understand what actually caused the Great Depression, for only by grasping the true source of the crisis can we appreciate how thoroughly FDR misdiagnosed and mistreated the patient. The myth tells us that unregulated capitalism collapsed under its own contradictions, requiring government rescue. The truth reveals government intervention as both the primary cause and the obstacle to natural recovery. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913 as a supposedly stabilizing force, actually destabilized the entire monetary system through its reckless manipulation of interest rates and money supply during the 1920s. Under Benjamin Strong's leadership, the Fed kept interest rates artificially low, fueling the very speculation bubble that would later burst. When they finally raised rates in 1928 and 1929, they triggered the inevitable correction, but then compounded the error by allowing the money supply to contract by 1/3 between 1929 and 1933. Meanwhile, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed by Herbert Hoover in 1930, demonstrated how government protectionism could turn a necessary correction into a global catastrophe. By raising tariffs to unprecedented levels, America triggered retaliatory measures worldwide, collapsing international trade just when global cooperation was most needed. This wasn't capitalism failing, it was government intervention destroying the market mechanisms that might have enabled swift recovery. Hoover's response revealed how even supposedly conservative politicians had absorbed progressive assumptions about government's role. Rather than allowing natural economic forces to clear out inefficient businesses and redirect resources toward productive uses, Hoover intervened massively, increasing government spending, launching public works projects, propping up failing businesses, and preventing the wage adjustments that might have restored employment. His Reconstruction Finance Corporation represented perhaps the first major example of what we now call crony capitalism, government picking winners and losers rather than allowing markets to function. The Depression deepened not because government did too little, but because it did too much of the wrong things. Every intervention prevented the natural healing process, like a doctor who keeps opening a wound that's trying to heal. By the time Roosevelt took office, the economy had been systematically prevented from recovering for nearly 4 years, not by some inherent failure of capitalism, but by the accumulated weight of government mistakes that blocked every avenue of natural restoration. Chapter 3: How Christian Values Built American Prosperity, and Why Abandoning Them Invited Disaster. The Great Depression represented more than economic failure. It marked a spiritual and moral crisis that reflected America's growing departure from the Christian principles that had originally shaped its remarkable prosperity. To understand both the magnitude of the crisis and Roosevelt's inadequate response, we must recognize how America's economic success had been built upon a foundation of Christian virtue, personal responsibility, and limited government that perfectly complemented free market principles. The American economic miracle of the 19th and early 20th centuries wasn't simply the result of natural resources or favorable geography. It grew from a culture shaped by Protestant work ethic, biblical principles of stewardship, and Christian understanding of human nature. The Founding Fathers, deeply influenced by Christian thought, created a system that assumed individual moral responsibility while constraining government power precisely because they understood both human potential and human fallibility. This Christian framework provided essential moral infrastructure for economic freedom. Biblical teachings about honest dealing, faithful service, and care for the genuinely needy created the trust necessary for complex commercial relationships. The Protestant emphasis on calling and vocation elevated honest work as service to God, motivating the extraordinary productivity that characterized American development. Most importantly, Christian understanding of human sinfulness led to constitutional constraints on power that prevented the kind of economic manipulation that would later cause such devastation. Roosevelt's New Deal represented a fundamental rejection of this Christian framework in favor of secular progressive ideology that placed ultimate faith in human planning and government power. Rather than appealing to individual moral responsibility and community charity, the traditional Christian response to economic hardship, Roosevelt promoted dependence on federal programs that undermined both personal initiative and local community bonds. The moral implications were profound and lasting. By suggesting that government could guarantee economic security and prosperity through proper management, Roosevelt was essentially claiming for the state powers that Christians recognized as belonging ultimately to divine providence. This represented not merely a policy error but a form of practical atheism that elevated human planning above trust in God's sovereignty and wisdom. The results speak for themselves. Instead of the swift recovery that might have followed a return to constitutional government and moral principles, America experienced a decade of prolonged suffering that ended only when World War forced temporary abandonment of New Deal policies. More tragically, Roosevelt's precedents created an expectation of government omnipotence that continues to corrupt American politics today, leading citizens to look to Washington rather than to God, family, and community for solutions to life's inevitable challenges. Chapter 4: The Intellectual's Great Betrayal: How Academic Theories Destroyed Practical Wisdom. Perhaps no aspect of the Roosevelt era better illustrates the dangerous gap between intellectual pretension and practical wisdom than the parade of academic advisors who surrounded FDR with fashionable theories divorced from both historical experience and economic reality. These men, brilliant in their own estimation, exemplified the intellectual arrogance that I've observed throughout my career studying how supposedly smart people consistently advocate policies that produce results opposite to their stated intentions. At the center of this academic circus stood men like Rexford Tugwell, Adolph Burley, and Raymond Moley, the famous brain trust, who believed their theoretical knowledge could reshape American society. Tugwell, a Columbia economics professor, openly advocated replacing constitutional government with expert administration, dismissing the Constitution as an outdated document unsuited to modern complexities. His contempt for traditional American principles was matched only by his ignorance of how real businesses actually operated and created wealth. These intellectuals shared a fatal flaw: they confused complexity with intelligence and theory with wisdom. Having spent their careers in academic environments where clever arguments mattered more than practical results, they approached the American economy like a laboratory experiment, seemingly oblivious to the fact that their failures would mean real suffering for real people. Their books and papers were filled with sophisticated analysis, but they had never met a payroll, built a business, or faced the practical challenges of creating wealth rather than merely redistributing it. What made their influence particularly pernicious was their absolute confidence in their own expertise combined with complete disdain for the accumulated wisdom of generations who had actually built American prosperity. They dismissed traditional constitutional constraints as primitive obstacles to enlightened governance, never grasping that these limitations existed precisely to prevent the kind of economic manipulation they enthusiastically promoted. The brain trust perfectly embodied the intellectual's characteristic vice, the belief that social reality can be remade through clever policies designed by smart people. They ignored the fundamental truth that economic systems, like living organisms, evolve through countless individual decisions and voluntary exchanges that no central authority can fully understand or control. Their faith in planning represented not scientific thinking but a form of secular religion that placed human reason in the position traditionally reserved for divine wisdom. Most damaging of all, these intellectuals provided Roosevelt with pseudoscientific justification for his political instincts toward greater government control. They gave academic respectability to policies driven more by Roosevelt's need to appear decisive than by any genuine understanding of economic principles. The result was a toxic combination of political ambition and intellectual arrogance that proved immune to correction by practical experience. When their policies failed, they simply advocated more of the same, convinced that any problems must result from insufficient implementation of their brilliant theories. Chapter 5: The New Deal's War on Recovery: How Government Intervention Prolonged Depression. The most damning evidence against Roosevelt's mythology lies in the simple fact that his policies consistently achieved results opposite to their stated purposes. Every major New Deal program designed to promote recovery actually hindered it, creating obstacles to the natural healing processes that had allowed America to recover from previous economic downturns with remarkable speed. This wasn't mere policy error, it was systematic destruction of the market mechanisms essential for genuine prosperity. Consider the National Recovery Administration, perhaps the most revealing example of New Deal thinking. Rather than allowing businesses to adjust prices and wages to restore profitability and employment, the NRA forced them to maintain artificially high prices and wages through government-mandated cartels. This prevented the very adjustments that might have restored balance between supply and demand, production and consumption. Small businesses were crushed by regulations designed by big business representatives, while consumers paid higher prices for goods they desperately needed to become more affordable. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration revealed even more clearly how intellectual arrogance could produce moral monstrosity. While millions of Americans went hungry, the AAA paid farmers to destroy crops and livestock, artificially restricting food supply to maintain high prices. The sight of government agents supervising the slaughter of pigs and destruction of cotton while breadlines formed in American cities should have shamed any administration with minimal moral sensitivity. Instead, Roosevelt's advisors praised this as enlightened policy. Perhaps most destructive was the constant threat of additional government intervention that prevented business investment and expansion. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Social Security Act, and countless other programs created an atmosphere of regulatory uncertainty that made long-term business planning virtually impossible. Why invest in expansion when government might change the rules tomorrow? Why hire workers when new labor regulations might make employment prohibitively expensive? Roosevelt's policies also created powerful constituencies for continued intervention. The various alphabet agencies provided jobs for political supporters while creating dependency among recipients who naturally supported politicians promising continued benefits. This wasn't economic policy but political engineering designed to maintain democratic power regardless of economic consequences. The supreme irony is that Roosevelt's reputation as a great economic manager rests entirely on his ability to blame others for problems his own policies created and prolonged. When recovery remained elusive year after year, he blamed business confidence, greedy capitalists, or insufficient government spending, never questioning whether his own interventions might be preventing the prosperity he claimed to seek. By 1937, 8 years after the crash and 4 years into the New Deal, unemployment remained at depression levels. Only the massive government spending and economic controls necessitated by World War II finally provided the external shock needed to override New Deal policies and restore something approaching full employment, though at the cost of converting the entire economy into a government-directed war machine. Chapter 6: The Constitutional Crisis: How Roosevelt Destroyed Limited Government. Beyond its economic failures, the New Deal represented a fundamental assault on the constitutional framework that had made American prosperity possible in the first place. Roosevelt didn't merely propose new policies, he systematically demolished the constitutional constraints on federal power that the Founding Fathers had carefully constructed to prevent exactly the kind of unlimited government he sought to create. The Constitution grants the federal government only enumerated powers, reserving all others to states and individuals. This wasn't mere formalism but reflected deep wisdom about human nature and the dangers of concentrated power. The founders understood that government, however well-intentioned, would inevitably expand beyond its proper bounds unless strictly limited by law. They designed a system that made government action difficult precisely because they knew that easy government action would inevitably become oppressive government action. Roosevelt viewed these constraints as obsolete obstacles to enlightened governance. When the Supreme Court initially struck down several New Deal programs as unconstitutional, he didn't accept correction and seek constitutional means to achieve his goals. Instead, he launched his infamous court-packing scheme, threatening to add justices until he achieved a compliant majority. Though this particular assault failed, it succeeded in intimidating the court into abandoning its constitutional role as guardian of limited government. The intellectual corruption was profound. Roosevelt's supporters argued that the Constitution should be interpreted as a living document that must adapt to changing circumstances, meaning, in practice, that it should impose no meaningful restraints on government power whatsoever. They claimed the founders couldn't have anticipated modern economic complexities, ignoring the fact that the principles of limited government and individual liberty were designed precisely to handle circumstances the founders couldn't foresee. This constitutional vandalism had devastating long-term consequences extending far beyond the 1930s. Once the precedent was established that federal power could expand to meet any claimed emergency or social need, subsequent generations of politicians found countless justifications for further expansions. The modern administrative state, with its maze of unaccountable bureaucracies wielding quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial powers, traces directly to Roosevelt's constitutional revolution. Perhaps most tragically, Roosevelt's success in breaking constitutional constraints prepared the ground for even more dangerous expansions of government power. If the federal government could regulate agriculture, manufacturing, and banking in the name of economic emergency, why not education, healthcare, and social relationships in the name of social justice? If constitutional limits could be ignored when convenient, what principle remained to constrain government ambition? The Founding Fathers would have recognized Roosevelt's program as precisely the kind of unlimited government they had fought a revolution to escape. They understood that free societies depend on government constrained by law, not government empowered to pursue any goal it considers worthy. By destroying these constraints, Roosevelt didn't modernize American government, he returned it to the arbitrary rule from which America had originally been designed to provide escape. Chapter 7, Lessons for Today, Why the New Deal Myth Still Threatens American Liberty. The persistence of the Roosevelt myth poses ongoing dangers to American liberty and prosperity that extend far beyond historical accuracy. Every contemporary crisis produces calls for another New Deal, as politicians invoke Roosevelt's memory to justify expansions of government power that repeat his fundamental errors while ignoring the lessons of his failures. Understanding why the New Deal actually failed becomes essential for protecting both constitutional government and genuine prosperity. Modern Americans have inherited Roosevelt's most toxic legacy, the assumption that government can and should solve every economic and social problem through sufficient political will and public spending. This belief corrupts political discourse by encouraging unrealistic expectations and fostering dependence on government solutions that consistently disappoint. When politicians promise that federal programs can guarantee prosperity, security, and happiness, they're repeating Roosevelt's fundamental error of claiming for government powers that exceed both constitutional authority and practical possibility. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how quickly contemporary politicians reach for Roosevelt-style solutions without considering their long-term consequences. Massive government spending, regulatory expansion, and emergency powers justified by temporary crisis quickly became permanent features of enlarged government. The economic disruption caused by these interventions, supply chain problems, inflation, labor shortages, mirror the patterns Roosevelt established during the 1930s, when emergency measures became permanent obstacles to recovery. Perhaps most dangerous is how the New Deal precedent encourages politicians to create crises they can then claim to solve. Roosevelt's supporters argue he restored confidence and hope during dark times, but this confuses symptom with cause. The confidence and hope came primarily from relief that government was finally doing something, not from evidence that government action was actually effective. This pattern encourages contemporary politicians to maintain crisis atmospheres that justify continued intervention, even when their own policies create or worsen the problems they claim to address. The intellectual climate surrounding current policy debates reveals Roosevelt's lasting influence in corrupting American political thought. Academic experts and media commentators routinely advocate for massive government programs while dismissing constitutional constraints as outdated formalism. They exhibit the same dangerous combination of theoretical sophistication and practical ignorance that characterized Roosevelt's brain trust, confident that good intentions and expert knowledge can overcome the economic laws that govern human behavior. Breaking free from the New Deal myth requires recovering the constitutional wisdom and economic understanding that originally made America prosperous. This means recognizing that government's proper role is protecting individual rights and maintaining the rule of law, not managing economic outcomes or guaranteeing personal security. It means understanding that genuine prosperity comes from voluntary exchange and productive investment, not from government spending and regulatory manipulation. Most importantly, it requires the moral courage to acknowledge that Roosevelt's reputation rests more on political theater than substantive achievement. His real legacy isn't economic recovery, which didn't occur until his policies were abandoned, but the dangerous precedent that government power should expand whenever politicians claim good intentions and sufficient expertise. Until Americans understand this truth, they remain vulnerable to future politicians who will use crisis to justify destroying the constitutional constraints essential for preserving both liberty and prosperity. Conclusion. The destruction of the Roosevelt myth isn't merely an exercise in historical revision, it's essential for preserving the constitutional principles and economic freedom that remain America's best hope for genuine prosperity. Roosevelt's failure wasn't personal but systemic, reflecting the inevitable results when government abandons its proper constitutional limits in pursuit of goals beyond its competence or authority. The evidence stands clear. Every major New Deal program prolonged rather than alleviated the Depression, while establishing dangerous precedents for unlimited government that continue corrupting American politics today. Roosevelt's reputation survives only because Americans have forgotten what genuine prosperity looks like and accepted government dependency as normal rather than recognizing it as the aberration it represents. Recovery requires rediscovering the constitutional wisdom and moral principles that originally made America exceptional. This means constraining government within its proper bounds, trusting free markets to coordinate economic activity, and recognizing that lasting prosperity comes from individual initiative and voluntary cooperation, not from political promises and bureaucratic management. The choice facing contemporary America mirrors the choice Roosevelt's generation failed to make. Will we preserve the constitutional framework designed to protect liberty and enable prosperity, or will we continue down the path of unlimited government that treats symptoms while worsening causes? History provides the answer, but only if we possess the courage to learn from truth rather than comfortable mythology.